I found out they had borrowed money under my name on the same morning I opened the letter and felt the world tilt as if someone had kicked the ground out from under me. I remember staring at the bold numbers printed across the page, my hands shaking while a cold rush crawled up my spine. The room around me felt too bright, too silent, as if every sound in the house had faded just to force me to hear the thundering pulse in my ears. I walked into their living room, still clutching that letter like a weapon, and found the woman arranging flowers as though nothing in the world could touch her serenity. The man sat nearby, humming contentedly while scrolling through his phone. I stood there waiting for them to look at me, but of course they didn't, not until I said a single trembling sentence. They took out loans in my name, didn't they? The woman barely lifted her gaze. Oh, that, she said, as if I had asked about the weather. It was for your siblings' education. You should be proud. I felt something inside me twist. She added, you never needed the money anyway, so why not help someone who actually matters? The words hit harder than the debt itself. I looked at the man, hoping he would deny it, but he only shrugged, saying anybody in this family should pitch in, especially you, since you've always had it easy. He smiled as if he had given me a compliment. The air thickened until it felt hard to breathe. I saw the dining table behind them still covered with the remains of a lavish breakfast: croissants, fruit platters, coffee steaming in expensive cups, all glowing beneath warm golden lights, their comfort pressed against my chest while I stood there clutching proof of the mess they had dumped onto my shoulders. The smell of citrus and roasted coffee mixed with a sharp metallic taste rising from my throat, and the room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, suffocating. I noticed the woman's perfectly manicured fingers tapping the table impatiently, the sound sharp and dismissive like a metronome counting down my breaking point. Then the man looked right at me and said, you'll pay it anyway, right? That's what you're good for, aren't you? After that, the silence inside my head turned into something cold and fixed. I felt the smooth paper of the loan statement cutting lightly into my palm as I tightened my grip. The number 85,000 burned into my vision, searing itself into my memory like a brand. The woman waved her hand and said, just sign whatever else we need later. It's family obligations, don't make a scene. The man chuckled softer this time, but the sound scraped through me. Until that moment I had still held a frail hope that if I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, stayed quiet enough, they might someday see me. Instead, they saw a resource, a convenient pocket, a name to use when theirs was no longer clean. I turned away from them, feeling the tremor in my fingers settling into something steadier, colder, more certain. The cut had opened and it would not close again. For a long time after that moment I felt myself sinking, as if the floor beneath me had turned to water, and every breath dragged me deeper into something heavy and dark. I moved through the days in a fog, replaying their voices again and again until they echoed so loudly inside my skull I could barely hear anything else. I woke each morning with the memory of the woman saying, someone who actually matters, and the man laughing as he called me good for paying their debts. That laughter followed me everywhere, clinging to me like a stain. At first I let myself crumble quietly. I would sit alone in my small room, staring at the loan papers spread across the table, feeling my chest tighten each time my eyes landed on the number. I didn't know which part hurt more, the betrayal or the way they had spoken, as though the betrayal was nothing at all. There were nights when I lay awake, unable to move, my thoughts stuck circling the same question: why was I never enough for them? Then slowly something shifted inside me, not with fire but with a quiet, relentless pressure, like a bruise turning into a scar. I realized that surviving them would require more than suffering in silence. It would require rebuilding everything they had taken from me piece by piece. Even if my hands shook through every step, I told myself that I needed to take control before their choices destroyed everything I had barely managed to build. So I started lifting myself from the numbness. I forced myself into action. I walked into an evening class the first night, trembling with nerves but determined to learn something that could give me leverage, something that belonged to me alone. I took on extra shifts until my body ached, but every paycheck felt like a small victory. I cut back on everything, saving relentlessly, keeping every cent tucked away as if I were stacking pieces of armor around my heart. I began keeping detailed records of everything they had done, every message, every receipt, every trace of the debts they created in my name. I filled pages with dates, numbers, and notes. Even though the act of writing sometimes made my stomach twist, I did it anyway because the truth felt like a shield, and I needed that shield more than I needed sleep. One evening, the woman called me, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, saying, "We need you to help again. It's family, remember?" I felt the familiar sting, but this time something strange happened. I didn't answer. I stared at the phone glowing in my hand, and for the first time, instead of guilt, I felt nothing, just a calm, steady emptiness. I let the call ring out, then fade into silence. I sat there staring at the dark screen, realizing that this was the first moment I had chosen myself over them, and the world did not fall apart. That small decision settled deep inside me like a spark, a reminder that I was not trapped, that I could reshape the path they had tried to bind me to. And with that realization, a quiet strength began to bloom inside me, slow, steady, and entirely my own. The shift came on a morning that felt too still, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break, and it did, in the form of a message from someone who barely knew me, someone who mentioned in passing that the man had been fired after a financial audit uncovered irregularities. I listened quietly, pretending it meant nothing, but inside I felt a faint tremor. Not satisfaction, just the strange awareness that a long-buried balance was beginning to tilt. Then more whispers drifted toward me from neighbors, coworkers, distant relatives, all hinting at the same unraveling, that the woman had been confronted by angry callers demanding repayment, that the sibling whose education they had sacrificed me for was now being questioned about suspicious tuition transfers, and that the family who once floated so confidently above everyone else was suddenly drowning. When the woman contacted me asking to speak, I felt no fear, only a calm weight in my chest. I told her she could come to my place, and the decision felt deliberate, like choosing the ground for a battle I did not start but was finally ready to finish. She arrived with the man, both of them standing in my doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, their eyes darting around my modest space as if trying to understand how I could exist without them. They sat on my worn couch, and for the first time I felt taller than them without moving an inch. The man spoke first, his voice forced into a false authority, saying, "Things have gotten complicated. We need you to step up for the family." I watched him quietly until his voice cracked just slightly. At the end, the woman leaned forward, her tone soft and trembling, saying, "You know, we love you. You have always been part of us. We just need help for a short time." Her words brushed against an old wound, but instead of bleeding, it hardened. I placed the folder on the table, thick with every document, every transfer, every message proving how long they had fed off my name. They froze the moment I opened it. I could almost feel the panic rising from them like heat. The man tried to force a smile, saying, "There is no need to exaggerate these things," but his voice wavered when I slid a page toward him. The woman whispered, "Is that really necessary?" But she could not take her eyes off the listed debts, the signatures that did not belong to me yet carried my name. I told them I knew about the education loans, the forged forms the money meant for my future redirected to maintain their comfort. I told them I knew every detail, and the silence that followed hung so heavy it felt alive. The man swallowed hard, trying to regain control, saying, "You are blowing this out of proportion. Families help each other. You owe us that." Much I looked straight at him and something inside me clicked into place. I said quietly, I owe you nothing. Their expressions cracked like glass under a slow, relentless pressure. I leaned back, letting the truth settle between us like a weight too large for them to lift, and for the first time they seemed to truly see me, not as a resource, not as a name to use, but as someone standing firmly outside their control. The air shifted, the room tightened, and I felt the story turning its course as if a new chapter had opened right there in the space between their collapsing certainty and my rising resolve. I let the silence coil tightly around us until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out steady in a way that startled even me. I told them I knew exactly why they were here, that the sudden affection, the sudden talk of family unity was nothing more than a last attempt to keep their world from collapsing. The man shifted, uncomfortably tugging at his sleeve, while the woman's eyes glistened as if she hoped tears might soften me the way they once had. She asked in a thin, trembling voice, "What do you want from us?" And the question felt almost unreal, because for so many years they acted as though I was not allowed to want anything at all. I leaned forward, letting the folder between us become the center of gravity, and said, "I'll help with the overdue amount, just enough to stop the foreclosure, nothing more, but you will admit exactly what you did, every word, every choice. No excuses, no rewriting history." The man's jaw tightened as if the demand insulted him. He barked out a brittle laugh, saying, "You think we're going to humiliate ourselves just to please you?" I looked at him without blinking and said, "You already humiliated me, you just never cared enough to notice." The woman tried a gentler tactic, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We were desperate. We didn't mean to hurt you. You know how things get complicated sometimes." I shook my head slowly and replied, "You took out loans in my name, you forged my signature, you chose convenience over honesty. That isn't complicated, that's intentional." Her breath caught sharp in her throat and she reached for the man's arm, but he pulled away, muttering under his breath that this was ridiculous, that I was exaggerating everything. I calmly slid another document toward them, a screenshot of the transfer from the account meant for me, redirected straight into tuition payments. The man stared at it, and for a split second fear flickered across his face. Before he masked it with anger, he leaned forward and hissed, "You wouldn't dare expose this. You'd ruin the family." I answered, "It's already ruined. You just never expected the pieces to land on you instead of me." He froze, the room went still, and the woman sank back into the couch, whispering, "Please don't do this. We can fix it. We can start over if you just help us." I felt something in me settle, solid and unwavering. I repeated my offer, "I will pay the exact amount you need, but you will acknowledge what you did out loud in front of me and everyone involved, and there will be no taking your words back." The woman covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling, while the man glared at me as if hatred alone could bend reality back in his favor. But even he could see the ground had shifted. I wasn't pleading, I wasn't bending, I was drawing a line they could no longer step over. Eventually the woman whispered, "We'll do it," her voice cracking open like something old and hollow. The man said nothing, but his silence was its own confession. I stood, walked to the door, and watched them follow as if dragged by the weight of their own choices, and as they stepped out into the fading light, I felt the world tilt again, but this time it tilted toward me, toward a power I had never been allowed to claim until now. The collapse arrived faster than even I expected, like a storm ripping open a roof that everyone insisted was strong enough to handle anything, and the first crack appeared in the form of a leaked email thread that spread across every corner of their social circle. Before dawn, people who once praised their generosity now whispered about forged signatures, misused loans, and a sibling's education paid for with money stolen from someone they treated as invisible. By midday, The room where the confrontation was set to happen was already buzzing with tension cameras. Phones, relatives, friends, and people who used to orbit around them for their glamour now circling like vultures, sensing something rotten beneath the surface. I walked in quietly, feeling the hum of voices pressing against my skin, but it did not shake me. The man stood at the center, looking pale beneath the harsh light, sweat gathering at his temples as he attempted a stiff smile. The woman hovered close behind him, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her clothes. A gesture that once radiated confidence, now frantic and desperate. A distant cousin murmured, "Is it true what they did?" And the words drifted toward me like a cold breeze. Another voice whispered, "If it is, they're finished, completely destroyed." The man caught my eye and I saw the fear beneath the thin, crumbling layer of pride. He motioned for me to come forward, but his voice cracked when he said, "Let's get this over with." They had agreed to confess, and everything in the room waited for it. The woman opened her mouth first, her voice shaking like a loose window in a storm. We took loans under their name for the tuition. We thought it was fine. We thought they would understand." A gasp sliced through the room, sharp enough to sting. The man tried to follow with something smoother, something rehearsed, but his words collided with the truth. Hanging heavy in the air, he stumbled, saying, "We didn't mean harm. Families help each other, but..." The crowd erupted immediately. "You forged documents. That's not help, that's fraud," someone shouted. "You used them, you ruined their future." The man's face drained of color until he looked ghost-like, his lips trembling as he tried to defend himself, but every attempt only made him collapse further. His sentences trailed off, his voice shrank, the room swallowing his authority piece by piece. The woman covered her face when someone asked, "Did you ever even ask for permission?" Her silence was the answer, and it echoed louder than any scream. Their downfall spread through the room like fire, reaching every person who once believed their polished mask a friend of theirs. Muttered, "I can't believe they did this." A neighbor shook her head and whispered, "They always acted so perfect. Their reputation, the only thing they ever protected, shattered completely." Right there in front of me, I stood still, watching them unravel, not with joy, not with anger, but with a strange, quiet emptiness, like standing in the ruins of a place that once hurt you so deeply you can no longer feel anything at all. The man tried one last time to speak, but his voice broke into a thin, pathetic sound that dissolved into the crowd's disdain. The woman sank into a chair, trembling as if the truth had stripped the ground from beneath her. I turned away as the room erupted again, voices rising, questions flying, their world collapsing in real time behind me. And as I stepped outside into the cool air, I felt something inside me loosen, the tightness I had carried for years finally unwinding, not in triumph but in release, a long, slow exhale that felt like stepping out of a cage I never realized had been locked around me until the moment it opened for good. When the noise of their collapse finally faded, I found myself standing in a kind of stillness I had never known before, a quiet that did not feel empty but spacious, as if the sky had stretched wider just to make room for me. I realized then that my life was no longer tethered to their choices or their expectations, and the absence of that weight settled over me like sunlight breaking through a long storm. The first thing I did was breathe in a way I had not breathed in years, slow, full, steady, letting the air reach places inside me that had been too tight for too long. I began rebuilding, not out of fear, not out of defiance, but out of a desire to finally live on my own terms. I took the compensation owed to me and set aside a portion for something meaningful, a fund created quietly without fanfare, meant for people who had been trapped in the same kind of family-made wounds, people who had been stripped of their voice by those who claimed to love them. Each request I approved felt like placing a small stone of justice back into the world, not heavy, not dramatic, just necessary. I also allowed myself to return to the dream I once abandoned, the one I told myself was childish because they insisted it was unimportant. I walked into a small workshop one morning and felt something familiar pulse awake inside me as my hands traced the tools waiting on the shelves. I worked slowly, at first awkward, uncertain, but with every passing day I felt my movements steadier, more honest, as if my body remembered what my mind had tried to forget. That space became mine, a place where I shaped something new from the pieces of who I had been before they bent me. I built a circle around me. Two, not a family by blood but one by choice, people who appeared without asking for anything. People who listened when I spoke, people who laughed with me rather than at me, people who stayed. Not because they needed something but because they cared. Their presence softened the edges of my days, and I realized how profoundly I had mistaken survival for connection for so many years. I thought often about forgiveness and found that it came to me not as a single moment but as a slow, gentle loosening. I did not want revenge, I did not crave their suffering, I simply wanted distance and peace, and the ability to move through my life without carrying their voices inside my head. I reached a quiet decision: I would not return to them, not physically, not emotionally. But I would not hold anger either. I granted them a distant kind of forgiveness, one that expected nothing, offered nothing, simply released the past from its grip on my future. The final shift happened on a morning filled with pale, soft light. I stepped outside and felt the cool breeze brush against my skin, and for the first time it felt like a beginning rather than an aftermath. I thought of the scars left behind by everything that had happened and realized they no longer throbbed with memory, they simply existed, quiet reminders of all I had endured. I whispered to myself that I was here, still standing, still choosing, still becoming someone new. And as the day opened before me, I understood something simple and profound: the story ahead was mine, and no one else would ever write it for me again.